I'm Linda, 26 female. I work as an archivist, spending my days preserving other people's histories while my own felt like it was paused. For the last 10 years, I've lived in the house my father built, a home I now shared with my mom, my stepfather Richard, and his son, Kyle. It was a life of quiet compromises, of tiptoeing around egos, all in the name of a fragile peace that was about to be shattered by the one thing my dad left me: everything. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. Peace in our house was a carefully constructed thing, as delicate as the brittle, yellowed paper I handle at work. It was a silence held together by unspoken rules, most of which revolved around not upsetting my stepfather, Richard. He had married my mother, Susan, 2 years after my father passed away from a sudden heart attack. I was 16 then, raw and adrift, and my mom was a ghost of herself. Richard, with his polished shoes and confident smile, presented himself as a lifeboat. It was only later I realized he was more of an anchor. My father, David, was a civil engineer. He wasn't a man of loud words or grand gestures. His love was in the things he built. The house we lived in was his masterpiece, a sprawling but cozy home nestled on 5 acres of woodland just outside the city. He designed every corner, chose every plank of wood, and planted every oak tree that now stood as a silent testament to his presence. The house was my sanctuary, the last tangible piece of him I had left. For him, it was more than a structure. It was our family's foundation, a legacy meant to last for generations. He always used to say, "Property, Linda, is one of the few things they can't take from you." A phrase whose importance I wouldn't fully grasp until much later. Richard, on the other hand, dealt in the abstract world of finance. As a financial advisor, he spoke in a language of portfolios, equities, and market projections, a language designed to sound impressive and impenetrable. He managed my mother's finances, which were modest, and always offered his unsolicited advice on my own small savings. "You have to make your money work for you, Linda," he'd say, leaning back in the leather armchair that used to be my dad's, a smug look on his face. I'd just nod politely, clutching my purse a little tighter. There was something about the way he looked at our home, a flicker of assessment in his eyes, as if he were constantly calculating its market value rather than appreciating its worth. My mom, Susan, was the buffer between us. A librarian by profession, she was a gentle soul who craved harmony above all else. She saw Richard as her rescuer and was fiercely protective of the new life he'd given her. She couldn't see, or perhaps refused to see, the subtle ways he chipped away at my father's memory. First, it was the small things. My dad's favorite armchair was moved to the study. His collection of vintage maps was replaced with generic abstract art. Each change was a small sting, a quiet erasure of the man who should have been there. When I tried to talk to her about it, she'd get a pained look on her face. "Richard just wants this to feel like his home, too, honey," she'd plead. "Please try to understand." So I tried. For her sake, I tried. I swallowed my resentment when Richard's son, Kyle, moved in a few years ago. Kyle was the living embodiment of his father's entitlement. At 21, he was a business student who treated our home like a hotel and my mom like his personal maid. He left his dirty clothes on the floor, ate food I'd bought without asking, and talked endlessly about the high-flying career his father was going to set him up with after graduation. He and Richard had a bond forged in mutual arrogance, often sharing inside jokes at my expense, smirking at my quiet nature and my dusty job. "Still playing with old papers, Linda?" Kyle would ask, walking past me with an air of superiority. I found my refuge in my work and in the memories held within the walls of the house. My job as an archivist was my solace. I loved the quiet, the order, the sense of purpose in preserving the past. It was the exact opposite of my home life, which felt chaotic and unstable. The house was my only other comfort. I'd walk the grounds my father had landscaped, tracing the grooves in the bark of the trees he'd planted. I'd sit in my room, the one he'd painted a soft blue for me when I was a little girl, and feel his presence. It was a constant, a silent promise that he was still with me. The fragile peace was maintained by a delicate balance of power. Richard was the undisputed king of the castle, his word was law. Mom was the peacekeeper, desperately trying to smooth over the cracks. Kyle was the crown prince, benefiting from his father's reign. And I was the quiet dissenter, the ghost of the old regime, tolerated as long as I didn't make waves. I paid a modest rent to my mother, contributed to groceries, and kept to myself. Richard often made comments about how it was time for me to fly the nest, not out of genuine concern for my independence, but with a clear desire to have the house, my father's house, all to himself. A woman your age should be building her own life, not living off her mother, he said one evening at the dinner table, after I mentioned I was putting a little extra money into my retirement account. I have a life, I replied calmly, not looking up from my plate, and I contribute my share here. It's not about the money, Linda, he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. It's about ambition. Your father, from what Susan tells me, was an ambitious man. He built things. You file things. Kyle snickered. My mother shot him a disapproving look before turning to me. Richard is just saying he wants the best for you, honey. But I knew what he was really saying. He was saying I didn't belong. He was saying that my presence was an inconvenience, a stubborn relic of a past he was determined to overwrite. That dinner was a stark reminder of my position in the family. I was an outsider in my own home. I felt a familiar pang of loss, a deep ache for my dad. He would have never let anyone make me feel so small. He would have seen Richard for exactly what he was. But my dad was gone, and I was left to navigate this treacherous new family dynamic on my own. I went to bed that night feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The peace was not just fragile, it was a lie, and I was living right in the middle of it. The 10-year anniversary of my father's passing was approaching. It was always a difficult time for me and my mom, a day marked by quiet reflection and shared memories. Usually, we would visit his grave together, lay fresh flowers, and then spend the evening looking through old photo albums. It was our ritual, a small, private way to honor him. This year, however, Richard announced he had other plans for us. I've booked a table at the Chandler, he declared one evening, a full week before the anniversary. The Chandler was one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, the kind of place Richard loved for its performance of wealth. It's time we started making new memories. We can't live in the past forever. My mother's face lit up. She loved grand gestures, and Richard's suggestion was a shiny distraction from the grief that always resurfaced around this time. "Oh, Richard, that's so thoughtful," she exclaimed. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "Mom," I said carefully after Richard had left the room, "don't you think we should, do what we always do? It's Dad's day." Her smile faltered. "Linda, Richard is trying. He knows it's a hard day for us, and he's trying to make it easier." "By erasing it," I countered, my voice sharper than I intended. "By pretending it's just another Saturday night we can dress up for." "That's not what he's doing," she said defensively. "He's creating a new tradition for our family, for all of us." I could see there was no getting through to her. To her, my resistance wasn't about honoring my father, it was about rejecting Richard. So once again, I swallowed my feelings and agreed to go. The week leading up to the anniversary was tense. Richard was unusually cheerful, talking incessantly about the restaurant's menu and what wine he was going to order. Kyle was excited for the free, fancy meal. I felt like I was being dragged to a party, celebrating the very thing that had shattered my world. The night of the anniversary arrived, cold and clear. I wore a simple black dress, my own quiet act of mourning. My mother, on the other hand, was wearing a bright red dress Richard had bought for her. She looked beautiful, but there was a strained quality to her smile. As we sat in the opulent, low-lit restaurant, I felt a profound sense of dislocation. The clinking of glasses and the hum of polite conversation felt like a world away from the quiet grief I held inside. Richard was in his element, holding court, telling some long, embellished story about a client's portfolio. He ordered the most expensive bottle of wine without even glancing at the price. Kyle was on his phone, probably posting pictures of his food to impress his friends. My mom was trying her best to include me in the conversation, but I could only offer monosyllabic answers. My mind was elsewhere with my dad. Then Richard raised his glass. "A toast," he said, his voice booming slightly. "To family, to moving forward and looking to the future." My mom and Kyle raised their glasses. I hesitated, my own glass remaining on the table. Richard's eyes narrowed at me. "Something wrong, Linda." "It's not just any night, Richard," I said, my voice low but firm. "It's the anniversary of my father's death." "Richard." Dee's charming facade cracked, just for a second. A flicker of annoyance crossed his face before he replaced it with a look of patronizing pity. "Linda, I know that, and believe me, I respect David's memory, but life is for the living. We honor the dead by living our own lives to the fullest. Wallowing in sadness does no one any good." His words were like a slap in the face. Wallowing? Was that what he thought our grief was? He was trivializing the most profound loss of my life, reframing it as a character flaw. "It's not wallowing," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "It's remembering." "And we can remember him any time," Richard said dismissively. He took a large gulp of his wine. "In fact, speaking of the future, Susan and I have been talking. This house, it's a lot for us to manage. 5 acres is practically a full-time job." My blood ran cold. I stared at him, then at my mother, who was suddenly looking down at her plate, refusing to meet my gaze. She knew this was coming. "What are you talking about?" I asked. "We're thinking of selling," Richard said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "The market is incredible right now. We could get a fortune for that land. We could buy a beautiful, modern condo downtown. No yard work, a pool, a gym, a real upgrade." I was speechless. Sell my father's house? The one thing he had built for us, the anchor of our family, the only real home I had ever known. The thought was so monstrous, so unthinkable, that I couldn't even form a coherent response. "You can't," I finally managed to whisper. "Oh, I think we can," Richard said with a smirk. "Legally, the house is your mother's, and as her husband, I'm just advising her on what's best for our financial future." He looked at my mom. "Isn't that right, honey?" My mom wrung her hands. "Linda, we would find a lovely place. You'd have a beautiful new room." "I don't want a new room." My voice rose, and a few heads at nearby tables turned. "I want my home, Dad's home." "Your dad is gone, Linda," Richard said, his voice now cold and hard. The mask was completely off. This wasn't a charming stepfather trying to help his family. This was a predator who had been patiently waiting for the right moment to strike. "The house is an asset, a valuable one, and it's frankly selfish of you to expect your mother and me to be tied to a property for sentimental reasons when it could be securing our retirement." "Our retirement," I shot back. "Or your retirement, what about Mom's sentimental reasons, or mine?" Kyle, who had been silent until now, chimed in. "God, Linda, stop being so dramatic, it's just a house. Dad's right, we could live somewhere way cooler." I felt a wave of nausea. They were a united front. They had discussed this, planned it, and chosen this night, the anniversary of my dad's death, to ambush me with it. It was a calculated act of cruelty, designed to put me in my place and show me how little my feelings or my father's legacy mattered to them. I looked at my mother, my eyes pleading with her. "Mom, you would really sell Dad's house?" She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "Linda, you don't understand the financial pressures Richard thinks." "I don't care what Richard thinks." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is about what's right, and selling Dad's house is wrong." Richard stood up too, his face red with anger. "You do not get to decide what's right in my family, young lady. You are a guest in that house, and you're starting to overstay your welcome." The threat was clear: obey or get out. The air was thick with it. The carefully constructed piece of the last 10 years had just been bulldozed. In the cold, clinical light of that expensive restaurant, I saw Richard for what he truly was: a greedy, manipulative man who had been wearing a mask of kindness all along. And my mother, trapped by her fear and her desire for a comfortable life, was his willing accomplice. I threw my napkin on the table and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them sitting there amidst the ruins of our family. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I could never go back to the lie I had been living. The battle for my father's legacy had just begun. I walked for hours that night, the cold air doing little to cool the fire in my chest. Each of Richard's words echoed in my mind, wallowing in sadness. "It's just a house. You're starting to overstay your welcome." The betrayal was so profound it left me breathless. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about the complete and utter disregard for my father, for me, and for the life we had before Richard. When I finally returned home long after midnight, the house was dark and silent. I crept up to my room, my heart pounding with a mixture of anger and fear. Richard's threat hung in the air. This was his house now, and I was living on borrowed time. The next few days were excruciating. A thick, suffocating silence filled every room. Richard and Kyle ignored me completely, while my mother would try to speak to me with a false brightness that was more insulting than the silence. She'd ask if I wanted tea or if I'd slept well, all while avoiding the massive, glaring issue that stood between us. I knew I couldn't stay. The atmosphere was toxic, and Richard was making it clear in 100 small ways that I was no longer welcome. He'd accidentally turn off the hot water heater before my shower. He'd make loud, pointed phone calls in the living room about the booming real estate market. Kyle would play his music obnoxiously loud late at night, right below my bedroom. It was a coordinated campaign of psychological warfare designed to drive me out. My breaking point came a week after the disastrous dinner. I came home from work to find a real estate agent sign hammered into our front lawn. It was a sleek, glossy sign with Richard's own agency logo on it. He hadn't just decided to sell the house, he was going to profit from the commission himself. The audacity of it stole the air from my lungs. I stormed into the house, my hands shaking. Richard was in the kitchen, pouring himself a drink, looking smug. "What is that?" I demanded, pointing out the window. He glanced at the sign and then back at me with a cool smile. "That, Linda, is progress. I've already had 3 calls about it. People are very interested in the land." "You had no right," I shouted. "Mom, did you agree to this?" My mother walked in from the living room, looking pale and stressed. "Linda, please don't shout. Richard and I decided it was for the best. It's better to be proactive." "Proactive? You're selling my home out from under me without even having the decency to tell me to my face." That's when Richard put his glass down with a sharp click. His smile was gone, replaced by a look of pure steel. "Let's get something straight," he said, his voice dangerously low. "This is not your home. It is your mother's property, and she and I, as her husband, have decided to sell it. You have been living here practically rent-free for years, and the free ride is over. You have 30 days to find a new place to live. After that, you'll be trespassing." 30 days? The words hit me like a physical blow. He was officially kicking me out. I looked to my mother for help, for any sign of support, but she just stood there, wringing her hands, a prisoner in her own home. She had made her choice. She had chosen him. Defeated, I retreated to my room and started to pack, my tears falling onto the clothes and books that held the memories of my entire life. It felt like I was packing away my childhood, my father, everything that had ever mattered. As I was clearing out the bottom drawer of my desk, my fingers brushed against a thick, sealed envelope I hadn't seen in years. In my father's familiar, neat handwriting, it said, "For Linda, to be opened in the event of my death." I had forgotten all about it. My mom had given it to me a few days after the funeral, but in the haze of my grief, I had tucked it away and never thought of it again. My hands trembled as I carefully broke the seal. Inside was a letter and a single, old-fashioned key. I read the letter first. "My dearest Linda, if you are reading this, it means I'm gone. I know this must be an impossibly difficult time for you, and I am so sorry I'm not there to guide you through it. I want you to know that my greatest joy in life was being your father. You are smarter and stronger than you know. I am entrusting you with this for a reason. Your mother is a wonderful woman, but her heart sometimes leads her, and she can be too trusting. I have always worried about her being taken advantage of. That's why I've made some specific arrangements to protect you both, but especially you, as my only child. This key is for a safe deposit box at the downtown branch of City Central Bank. The box is under your name and mine. Inside, you will find all the necessary documents that outline my true last wishes. Please take them to my lawyer, Mr. Peterson. His contact information is in the box. Do not speak of this to anyone else, not even your mother, until you have spoken with him. Trust him. He was my friend long before he was my lawyer. Know that I love you more than words can say. Be strong, be smart, and always protect what is yours. Love. Dad. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. My father, even from the grave, was still looking out for me. He had anticipated this. He had known, somehow, that my mother might be swayed and that I would need protection. It was a final gift, a lifeline thrown across a decade. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in my career. With the key clutched in my hand, I drove downtown to the bank, my mind racing. What could be in that box? What arrangements had he made? The bank was an old, formidable building with marble floors and high ceilings. I was led by a stern-looking employee into the vault, a massive circular door swinging open to reveal rows upon rows of shiny metal boxes. He located the one registered to my father and me, used his key and mine, and pulled out a long, heavy box. He left me alone in a small, private viewing room. My heart was hammering against my ribs as I lifted the lid. Inside, it was packed with documents. There was a thick, bound document on top that was clearly a will, but it wasn't just any will. The title read, "The Last Will and Testament of David Miller, Updated." Below it was an official-looking document with a title that made my breath catch in my throat, "Irrevocable Trust Agreement for the Benefit of Linda Miller." I slowly began to read. My father, a meticulous planner in death as he was in life, had structured his entire estate in a way that I never could have imagined. He had left my mother a generous lifetime stipend and the right to live in the house for as long as she wished. But he had not given her ownership. Ownership of the house, the 5 acres of land, and his entire investment portfolio, which was far more substantial than I ever knew, had been placed into an irrevocable trust. A trust that had been legally sealed and untouchable for 10 years. A trust of which I, Linda Miller, was the sole beneficiary, and upon my 26th birthday, the sole trustee. My 26th birthday had been 3 months ago. I sank back into my chair, the documents spread out before me. The house wasn't my mother's to sell. It was mine. It had been mine for months. Richard's entire plan, his smug pronouncements, his eviction notice, it was all built on a foundation of lies and ignorance. He had assumed, and my mother had let him assume, that she had inherited everything. But my father, in his quiet wisdom, had protected his legacy. He had protected me. The letter also contained a business card for Mr. Peterson. I packed everything back into the box, my hands no longer shaking with fear, but with a surge of adrenaline. Richard hadn't just made a mistake. He had declared war on the wrong person. He thought he was kicking out a grieving, powerless young woman. He had no idea he was trying to evict the legal owner of the very ground he stood on. This wasn't just a gift from my father. It was ammunition. And I was going to use every last round. Walking out of that bank, I felt like a different person. The fear and helplessness that had been my constant companions for the past week had been replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. My father's letter and the contents of that box were a shield and a sword. But before I could go on the offensive, I needed a general. I needed Mr. Peterson. His office was in a modest but respectable downtown building, the kind of place that prioritized substance over style. The plaque on the door simply read, "Peterson and Associates Estate Law." Mr. Peterson himself was exactly as I pictured him, in his late 60s, with kind eyes, a firm handshake, and an air of quiet competence that immediately put me at ease. He remembered me as a little girl, which made the difficult conversation ahead a little easier. I sat across from his large oak desk and laid out the entire story, my voice steady as I recounted the dinner, Richard's threats, the for sale sign, and the 30-day eviction notice. Then, I pushed the documents from the safe deposit box across the desk. He listened patiently, his expression growing more serious with every word. He then spent the next hour silently reading through the will and the trust agreement, occasionally nodding to himself or making a small note on a legal pad. When he finally looked up, his expression was grim but resolute. "Your father was a very smart man, Linda," he said, "and very prescient. This trust is ironclad. The house, the land, and all the assets listed within have legally been under your control since your 26th birthday. Your mother has the right to reside there, but she has absolutely no authority to sell it. Richard has no legal standing whatsoever." A wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy washed over me. "So, he can't kick me out." "On the contrary," Mr. Peterson said with a thin smile. "As the owner of the property and the trustee, you could technically have him removed. He is, in essence, a guest of your mother, S., who is herself a guest of the trust." The reversal of power was so absolute it was almost comical. Richard, the self-proclaimed king of the castle, was nothing more than a tenant by marriage with no rights. "But there's more here," Mr. Peterson continued, his tone shifting. "Your father's foresight went beyond just protecting the assets. He was worried about your mother's financial vulnerability. Richard has been managing her finances, you said." "Yes, for years," I confirmed. "I think it would be wise to see exactly what he's been managing," Mr. Peterson suggested. "This trust gives you, as the trustee, significant power. We can subpoena his financial records, especially any that are linked to your mother's accounts or that involve marital assets. If he's been advising her to sell a property he knew was valuable, all while having no legal right to do so, it points to a significant breach of ethics for a financial advisor. But I suspect it's worse than that. Men like this, who are in a hurry to liquidate a major asset, are usually in some kind of trouble." And so the investigation began. Over the next 2 weeks, Mr. Peterson and I worked in secret. He filed the necessary legal paperwork, and I started my own quiet digging at home. I became a ghost in the house, silent and observant. I listened to Richard's hushed, stressed phone calls. I saw the stacks of mail he started hiding in his briefcase instead of leaving on the kitchen counter. I noticed the way he flinched every time the phone rang. The confident, smug man was gone, replaced by someone who looked haunted and desperate. The first breakthrough came when Mr. Peterson's subpoena for Richard's professional records was granted. We discovered that Richard's financial advisory firm wasn't the roaring success he pretended it was. In fact, it was failing. He had lost several key clients over the past year due to poor, high-risk investments. He was being investigated by the Financial Regulatory Authority for misconduct after a former client filed a formal complaint. He wasn't just unethical, he was on the verge of losing his license. The second, more damning discovery came from his personal financial records. Richard was drowning in debt. He had taken out a massive, high-interest business loan to keep his firm afloat, and he had used the house, my father's house, as collateral. I stared at the document in Mr. Peterson's office, my blood boiling. How could he use the house as collateral? It wasn't his. "He forged your mother's signature on a document that misrepresented her as the sole owner," Mr. Peterson explained, his voice tight with anger. "And he found a predatory lender who was willing to overlook the proper title search in exchange for a higher interest rate. It's fraud, Linda. Multiple counts of it. He was planning to use the proceeds from the sale of the house to pay back the loan before the lender or the authorities discovered the fraud. He wasn't just trying to secure his retirement, he was trying to stay out of prison." Suddenly, everything made sense. His desperation, his cruelty, the insane rush to sell the property. He had built a house of cards, and he was counting on my inheritance to keep it from collapsing. He had viewed my father's legacy not as a home, but as a get-out-of-jail-free card. The final piece of the puzzle was Kyle. I did some searching on his social media, which he'd foolishly left public. Beneath the posts of expensive meals and parties were hints of his own financial recklessness. He'd posted pictures of a new sports car, a car I knew he couldn't afford on his own. A little more digging with the information Mr. Peterson had found revealed that Richard had been funneling what little money he had left into Kyle's name, likely trying to shield it from his creditors. He was even paying for Kyle's tuition and extravagant lifestyle with funds from his dwindling business account. The picture was now complete and utterly ugly. Richard was a fraud and a failure, both professionally and personally. He had manipulated my mother, committed fraud using my home, and was preparing to throw me out on the street to save his own skin. He had lied to everyone, including his own son, about the fantasy of success he was living. The anger I felt was a pure, cold fury. He hadn't just disrespected my father's memory, he had actively used it in a criminal conspiracy. Mr. Peterson and I now had all the information we needed. We had unraveled every single one of his lies. Now, it was time to build the trap. With the full, ugly truth laid bare, my grief transformed into something else entirely. It became fuel. The passive, quiet Linda who tiptoed around her own house was gone. In her place stood the sole trustee of the David Miller estate, and she was about to become the architect of Richard's ruin. My first meeting with Mr. Peterson after uncovering the fraud was less about law and more about strategy. We weren't just going to stop Richard. We were going to dismantle his entire life, using his own greed and deceit as the tools of his destruction. Our plan had to be methodical, legal, and absolute. "He has two primary vulnerabilities," Mr. Peterson said, pointing to two separate piles of documents on his desk. "His debt and his professional license. We attack both simultaneously." Phase 1, the debt. The predatory lender who had given Richard the fraudulent loan was our first target. "They operate in a legal gray area," Mr. Peterson explained. "They don't like scrutiny. The last thing they want is to be implicated in a major fraud case." Our move was simple yet devastating. Acting as the trustee of my father's estate, which held significant liquid assets, I made the lending company an offer. I would buy Richard's entire debt from them in full for a small premium. To them, it was a golden ticket. They would get all their money back immediately, plus a profit, and completely wash their hands of a loan that was about to become a legal nightmare. They didn't have to think twice. Within 3 days, the deal was done. I, Linda Miller, was now the legal owner of my stepfather's crippling debt. He no longer owed a shady company, he owed me. Phase 2, the professional ruin. While the debt transfer was being processed, Mr. Peterson compiled a comprehensive dossier on Richard's professional misconduct. It included the evidence of his failing business, the formal complaint from his previous client, and, most damningly, the undeniable proof of the loan fraud he had committed using my house. We sent one copy of this dossier to the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA, the body that governed his license. We sent another copy to the state's Attorney General's office, flagging the criminal fraud. And we sent a third copy to the board of directors of the national wealth management firm that Richard's small local branch was affiliated with. We didn't just report him, we ensured that every single professional body that had power over him knew exactly what he had done. His career as a financial advisor was, for all intents and purposes, over. He just didn't know it yet. Phase 3, the family. This was the hardest part of the plan. It involved my mother. I knew that she was a victim in all of this, but she was also an enabler. Her willful blindness had allowed Richard's cancer to grow in our home. She needed to see the truth, unfiltered and undeniable. I asked Mr. Peterson to arrange a formal meeting at his office. I requested that both my mother and Kyle be present. I told my mom it was a mandatory legal meeting regarding the estate that required her attendance. The lie felt bitter in my mouth, but it was necessary. The day before the meeting, I executed the final preparatory step. Using my authority as the legal owner of the house, I contacted a property management company and had formal eviction notices drawn up. One for Richard, one for Kyle. They were legally watertight, giving them the state-mandated minimum of 30 days to vacate the premises, the same 30 days Richard had so cruelly given me. During these weeks of planning, I lived a double life. At home, I was a ticking clock. I was polite, distant, and utterly unreadable. Richard, consumed by his own spiraling stress, barely noticed. He was too busy taking hushed, angry phone calls and trying to secure a quick sale on a house that was no longer his to sell. He even brought a potential buyer to walk through the property one afternoon. I watched from my bedroom window, a cold calmness settling over me. Let him play his little games. The board was set, and all the pieces were mine. The night before the final confrontation, I walked through my father's house, from room to room, touching the walls, the furniture, the photos on the mantelpiece. Richard had tried to erase my father, to overwrite his legacy with his own cheap, fraudulent ambition. He had seen the house as a pile of cash, a quick fix for his pathetic, self-inflicted problems. He failed to understand that this house wasn't made of just wood and nails. It was made of love and memory, and it had a foundation of iron, my father's foresight and my own resolve. I was no longer just the keeper of my father's archives, I was the guardian of his legacy. Richard had wanted to kick me out so he could steal everything my dad had built, but he had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated the man my father was, and he had underestimated his daughter. Tomorrow, he wouldn't just lose the house, he would lose everything. The trap was set. All that was left was to watch him walk right into it. The air in Mr. Peterson's conference room was thick with tension. I sat on one side of the long, polished table with Mr. Peterson beside me, a neat stack of files placed squarely in front of us. On the other side sat my mother, looking nervous and confused. Beside her, Kyle was slumped in his chair, impatiently scrolling through his phone. Richard, however, was a storm cloud of indignation. He had been furious about being summoned to a lawyer's office, seeing it as some pathetic, last-ditch effort on my part. "All right, Peterson," Richard began, not even looking at me. "Let's get this over with. Whatever sob story Linda has cooked up, it's not going to change anything. The house is being sold, and she has until the end of the month to get out." Mr. Peterson didn't flinch. He simply looked at Richard, his expression unreadable. "Actually, Richard, that's the first thing we need to discuss. The house cannot be sold." Richard laughed, a short barking sound. "What are you talking about? Susan owns the house. It's marital property." "That is incorrect," Mr. Peterson stated calmly. He slid a copy of my father's will and the trust agreement across the table. "As per the final will and testament of David Miller, your wife, Susan, was granted lifetime residency rights, but not ownership. The property, along with all other major assets, was placed into an irrevocable trust for the sole benefit of his daughter, Linda. As of her 26th birthday, Linda became the sole trustee and legal owner of the property. She has been the legal owner for the past 3 months." The color drained from Richard's face. He stared at the documents, then at me, his eyes wide with disbelief. Kyle finally looked up from his phone, a confused frown on his face. "What, Mom, is that true?" My mother looked utterly bewildered. I don't understand. David told me I'd be taken care of." "And you have been, Susan," Mr. Peterson said gently. "The trust provides you with a generous stipend for the rest of your life. But your late husband, in his wisdom, wanted to ensure his legacy was protected for his child. The house belongs to Linda." Richard lunged for the documents, his hands shaking as he scanned the legal text. He was looking for a loophole, a flaw, anything. But there was nothing. The language was precise and unassailable. He slowly sank back into his chair, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. The foundation of his entire plan had just turned to dust. "So the sale is off," he muttered, his mind clearly racing to calculate the new extent of his disaster. "Oh, the sale is most definitely off," I said, speaking for the first time. My voice was calm and cold. "But that's really the least of your problems, Richard." Mr. Peterson slid a second file across the table. "This is a copy of a loan agreement you took out 3 months ago with a high-interest lending firm, a loan for $200,000. Richard flinched as if he'd been struck. In that agreement, I continued, you illegally used my house as collateral, forging my mother's signature on a document that misrepresented her as the owner. That's bank fraud, Richard. That's a lie, he stammered, but the panic in his eyes told a different story. Is it? I countered. Because that lending firm was more than happy to cooperate with us once we informed them of the fraud. So happy, in fact, that they sold us your debt. The David Miller Trust now owns your loan, Richard. You owe the money to me. My mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Richard, you took out a loan against the house. He ignored her, his eyes locked on me, full of a venomous hatred. And there's more, Mr. Peterson said, pushing a third file forward. This is a copy of the dossier we have sent to FINRA and the Attorney General's office. It details your professional misconduct, the client complaint against you, and the criminal fraud you just committed. I expect you'll be hearing from them very soon. Your license will be revoked, and it's very likely you'll be facing criminal charges. Kyle finally spoke, his voice cracking. Dad, what are they talking about? Richard was speechless. He was cornered, exposed, and utterly defeated, the architect of his own ruin, just as I had planned. I stood up and walked around the table, stopping directly in front of him and Kyle. I placed 2 envelopes on the table before them. What's this? Kyle asked, his usual arrogance gone, replaced by a childish fear. That, I said, my voice devoid of all emotion, is your final notice. You both have 30 days to vacate my property. Exactly the same amount of time you gave me, Richard. Richard finally snapped. He shot up from his chair, his face purple with rage. You can't do this. Susan, you can't let her do this. I am your husband. My mother, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally looked at him. But the look in her eyes was not one of support. It was one of dawning horror and betrayal. She saw him, finally, for the man he was, a liar, a fraud, and a coward who had used her and nearly destroyed her daughter's birthright. You forged my name, Richard, she whispered. You lied to me about everything. I did it for us, he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. No, I said, my voice cutting through the room. You did it for you. You were drowning, and you tried to pull us all down with you. I looked at my mother, my heart aching for the pain she was feeling, but knowing this was a necessary agony. Then I looked at Kyle, who was staring at his eviction notice as if it were written in a foreign language. His entire future, bankrolled by his father's lies, had just evaporated. I turned and walked to the door, with Mr. Peterson following. I paused with my hand on the handle and looked back at the wreckage of the family Richard had tried to build. The locks will be changed in 30 days, Richard, I said. I'd suggest you start packing. Then I walked out, leaving him to face the consequences of his actions. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see but the past, and for the first time in a very long time, I was finally free to walk toward my future. The 30 days that followed were a quiet, surreal countdown. Richard and Kyle were like phantoms in the house, their presence marked only by the sound of boxes being taped up and the occasional muffled argument that would seep through the walls. Richard's rage had collapsed into a sullen, defeated silence. He avoided me entirely. All the bluster, all the arrogance, had been stripped away, leaving behind the small, pathetic man he'd been all along. Kyle tried to approach me once, catching me in the hallway. The entitled smirk was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading look. Linda, you can't really be kicking us out, he said. My dad, he made a mistake, but we have nowhere to go. That is not my problem, Kyle, I replied, my voice calm but unyielding. You and your father were perfectly happy to make it my problem a month ago. You reap what you sow. He saw the iron in my eyes and didn't try to speak to me again. The most difficult part was navigating the situation with my mother. She was a wreck, caught between a decade of loyalty to a man she thought she knew and the devastating truth of his betrayal. She cried for days, both for the loss of her marriage and for her own blindness. I didn't offer false comfort or easy forgiveness. I just gave her space, and I gave her the truth whenever she asked for it. How did I not see it, Linda? She asked me one evening, as we sat in the quiet living room, surrounded by half-packed boxes. "You wanted to see the good in him, Mom," I said gently. "He counted on that." Richard's professional life imploded just as Mr. Peterson had predicted. He was formally suspended by FINRA pending a full investigation. His affiliation with the national firm was terminated, and the Attorney General's office confirmed they were opening a criminal case. His clients left him in droves. He was ruined. On the final day, a moving truck pulled into the driveway. It was a small one. It turned out they didn't have much that was truly theirs. So many of their possessions had been bought on credit they could no longer afford. I watched from the window as they loaded up their boxes. Richard didn't even look at the house. He couldn't. My mother made her decision that morning. She came to me as Richard was carrying the last box to the truck, her own suitcase packed and standing by the door. "I can't stay here, Linda," she said, her voice heavy with sorrow. "Not right now. There are too many ghosts." My heart ached, but I understood. "Where will you go?" "I have a sister in Oregon. I'll stay with her for a while. I need to figure out who I am without him." She looked at me, her eyes full of a regret so deep it was bottomless. "I am so sorry, Linda. I should have protected you. Your father would be so ashamed of me." "Dad wouldn't be ashamed," I said, pulling her into a hug. "He would just be glad that you're finally safe." She left an hour after Richard did. And then, for the first time in a decade, the house was silent. It wasn't the suffocating, tense silence of before. It was a peaceful, clean silence. It was mine. In the months that followed, I began the slow process of reclaiming my home. I took down the generic art and hung my father's old maps back on the walls. I moved his favorite armchair back to its rightful place by the fireplace. I hired a landscaping company to help me restore the gardens he had so lovingly designed. With every change, it felt less like I was undoing Richard's damage and more like I was building something new on the strong foundation my father had left me. Mr. Peterson handled the legal fallout. Richard, facing overwhelming evidence, pleaded guilty to fraud to avoid a longer sentence. He was given 2 years of probation and ordered to pay a hefty restitution, which he had no means of doing. His debt to me remained on the books, a permanent legal anchor tied to his name. My mother officially filed for divorce. About a year later, I was sitting on the back porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my mom. It was a picture of her standing in front of a small library in Oregon, holding a "now hiring" sign. The caption read, "Applying for a job, building my own foundation." I smiled, a real genuine smile. We were both healing in our own ways. The house was no longer a battleground or a museum of grief. It was alive again. It was a home. My father had given me a gift beyond price, not just the property and the money, but the strength to protect it. He had taught me that a foundation isn't just concrete and wood. It's the love, integrity, and foresight you build into things that matter. Richard had tried to demolish it, but he'd only succeeded in demolishing himself. I had preserved my father's past, and in doing so, I had finally secured my own future.